sleepless Alagadda we dream, of a rope round the neck of a king, of a laugh behind a mask, of a question never asked. What is the Hanged King? Hello, dear viewer. My name is Sparrow, and this is Sparrow Catches Up, a channel where I delve into all of the things that make our hearts race. Today, we're looking at the SCP Universe, the Hanged King specifically. I intend for this to be an in-depth overview of what I believe the Hanged King to be, based off my own personal interpretations of the text available in the tag on the SCP Wiki. Anyone can submit an article within the universe and have it added to the canon. SCP stands for Secure, Contain, Protect, and is the motto of the Foundation, a fictional clandestine body that deals with what they call anomalies. Anomalies are basically what the word entails, things that defy conventional logic in one way or another. There are things like a statue that kills you if it's not observed, a coffee machine with a keyboard that can dispense almost anything you can think of, a very large, very hard to kill lizard, and that's just the surface. Today's topic, the Hanged King, is one of my absolute favorite SCPs. He does technically have a designation being a string of numbers and letters meant to identify anomalies within the Foundation itself. But it's used in only one article, and it's a little bit cumbersome. It's SCP-2264-5, which it's a bit of a mouthful, so we'll just be sticking with calling him the Hanged King. So what is the Hanged King? That question is harder to answer than one might think. In essence, he is a godlike being who rules in a kingdom called Alagadda, which is an extra-dimensional city. It does not correspond with any of our real-world locales, and things originating in Alagadda are unable to be brought over into our baseline reality, at least without great cost. The kingdom he rules is one of never-ending mirth. The residents of Alagadda all wear masks and engage in all manner of hedonism. The masks cannot be removed, and visitors to Alagadda are given masks or appear there with masks already on their face so that they can fit in with the residents of Alagadda. I plan on going into Alagadda in more depth in its own video, but for now you've got the basics. Kingdom outside of our reality where every day is a hedonistic masquerade. There is another side to Alagadda, however, and one where you're much more likely to gain proper access to the king himself. If you move down far enough, whatever constitutes down in a non-Euclidean space, you can come across the true face of Alagadda. The buildings are dilapidated. There is no dancing in the streets. There is no anything in the streets. You might hear the laughing call of a crow, a whisper urging you forward and warning you back at the same time. A creeping sense of dread will fill your gut. As you move across the cold, cobbled stones, smelling air thick with the scent of mold and old books, you'll find yourself in the castle. Continue further into its abandoned depths, and there you'll find him on his throne. Forever on his throne. The Hanged King. It is scarcely a man who sits before you, but rather a writhing, moaning thing. To his side stands his ambassador, the only maskless denizen in the city of masks. Somehow they are almost more chilling than the king himself. The throne is not one of opulence, but of torture. Large spikes drive through it and into the Hanged King, keeping him pinned to the throne. You cannot tell if he exists in ecstasy, agony, or some stomach-churning mixture of both. The ambassador reaches a hand out to lift the covering on the king's face, a veil or a bag, you cannot tell, and a deafening wail reaches your ears. You cannot move. You cannot breathe. You cannot think. It feels like the very essence of your being is being ripped asunder and remade, only to be ripped apart again and again in a maddening cycle of torture. You can hear the ambassador laughing, and the crows are laughing with him, and somewhere the king is laughing and crying and screaming, and you awaken in one of the libraries in Alagadda. Only a candle on a desk keeps out the encroaching dark. You have just come face to face with the ruler of Alagadda and learned one terrifying truth. He is no god. He is a god-shaped hole. The appearance of the Hanged King varies from tale to tale. In some, his noose is a simple woolen rope, in others, a length of white silk, and in others still, it is a rope of thorns. It is always present, however, the same as some sort of face covering, either taking the form of a veil or a bag over his head. His body is clad in tattered rags that allow something white and writhing to peek through, though there currently isn't any information on what this thing underneath his rags might be. He usually has a crown as well, though this is given little consideration to description for the most part. It's sometimes described quite biblically like a crown of thorns, but if memory serves correctly, there is only one instance of that description, and it isn't present in other stories. I think often it's just assumed that because he is a king, he must have a crown, and we don't need to think further on that, and that's frankly fine with me. Interestingly, the accounts also vary on whether or not the king is able to speak. A Wandsman in the court of the Hanged King, where I drew inspiration for our little vignette up there, treats him as totally nonverbal, only able to speak through the ambassador. This is the case in a few other tales of the Hanged King, often citing the damage from the ligature around his neck as the cause for this inability to vocalize. Other tales will have him being completely articulate. Clown Town and Where the Maps Ended come to mind for that sort of interpretation. He also, at least in The King in Chains, has cognizance enough to have a robust inner dialogue. I've mentioned the ambassador of the Hanged King twice now, and they're an important figure in the Alagaddan narrative. As far as I can tell, the ambassador is what's known as a reality bender in the SCP universe. They are often noted as very powerful and dangerous, and the ambassador absolutely fits that bill. What a reality bender is someone who can bend and shape reality to their will. It's exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's heavily implied throughout the multitude of texts on the wiki that the ambassador is likely the one actually pulling the strings, the Hanged King being, ironically, just a puppet. In A Wandsman in the Court of the Hanged King, the rope around the king's neck is described as a puppet's string, or like a puppet's string. And it isn't the only time where there is imagery of puppets that is ascribed to him. It's also ascribed to what are known as the Lords of Alagadda, essentially 4 rulers beneath the Hanged King that take care of their own areas within the kingdom. There's the White Lord, the wearer of the Diligent Mask, the Red Lord, the wearer of the Mirthful Mask, the Yellow Lord, the wearer of the Odious Mask, and the Black Lord, the wearer of the Anguished Mask. The Wandsmen describe them as having marionette heads, and a further SCP article, SCP-035, gives us the knowledge that it's likely that there aren't people that are the lords, but rather the lords are the masks on top of these marionette heads themselves. So essentially, more puppeteers in Alagadda. I'm absolutely enthralled with the entire aesthetic of Alagadda and the Hanged King. For those who don't know, I'm a theater major and a lifelong actor. The entirety of the canon has a lot to do not only with theater in general, but in aspects that are heavily associated with a specific type of theater, commedia dell'arte. Commedia was a style of theater performed in Italy between the 16th and 18th centuries. It was made notable by its use of masked performers, each playing a particular archetype. You're likely familiar with some of these archetypes, at least by name, such as Arlecchino, or as we know it, Harlequin, Piero, or Scaramouche. The masks heavily influenced masquerades, with the popular costumes to the party being inspired by the archetypes and masks of the commedia performers. I think using these masks for the setting not only creates a stunning visual for Alagadda, but also serves to further its narrative, given that the commedia characters are all really just very simple archetypes when broken down, characters, if you will, and the residents of Alagadda are much the same. To explain that better, let's get into the question I came to realize was better to ask in this case, instead of what. Who is the Hanged King? Looking at the plethora of material we have from the Foundation, there are quite a few retellings of the Hanged King's origins. All of them have at least some consistencies that we will go over at the end, but the elements that are present in every single retelling is there was a king, he was hanged, and then he returned. For simplicity's sake, I'll be covering the articles I used for his origin stories in alphabetical order. Any I've omitted were on the grounds of them being written purely for a canon divergent universe with the purpose of being canon divergent. Or I might have just missed some. As always, please feel free to share anything I've missed in the comments. The first article I want to look at is about the Serpent. A Chinese tale of the Hanged King, it tells of a king and an emperor both craving eternal life. The king gambles with the three lords of death and loses each time. In return, the lords of death take the lives of those in his kingdom, human and beast alike, through disaster and plague. As one can imagine, those aren't necessarily all-consuming, and some of the subjects survive. These survivors, angry with the king, trap him within his palace. In terror, the king calls upon the Great Abyss, as he did before when gambling with the lords of death. A faceless god answers him and tells him that he must die for 3 days, but will return after, and that by consuming all blood you shall live. The king hangs himself in his court, and his people rejoice. They expose his body in the wild, where the king is feasted upon by crows. 3 days after this, the entire kingdom is dead, bloodless. The faceless god sends its emissary with a cup filled with the blood of the kingdom. The king attempts to take the cup and drink of it, but the damage from the crows made him weak, and he drops the cup, spilling the blood, which becomes a river. The god tells him then, "You cannot live, and you may not die." The king begs for more blood, for another chance, but it is then that he hears the lords of death laugh. They turn into crows and fly off. He is punished for his hubris and his greed. The emperor, one of great renown, whom people of unique talents call upon regularly, sent out a request to his lands. "I seek eternal life." He is visited by multiple people, each with their own gift or advice for the emperor. One says he can live eternal through the hearts and memories of his people and gives him a tome of all the languages of the world. The king rejects this and burns the tome. One tells him if he replaces his body with machines, he may live forever. The king rejects this and treats it as insanity. Finally, a messenger from Aditum comes to the emperor and tells him if he simply worships Nuwa and the 6 beasts under her throne, that he can achieve eternal life. The emperor is pleased with this answer, and the messenger, Shufu, tells him all he requires in return is the lives of 500 children. Simple, right? The sacrifice is given, and soon the emperor is visited by a beast from under the great dragon's throne, the great dragon being another name for Nuwa. He is told that he must sacrifice a person daily to Nuwa as a show of gratitude. The emperor, in his zeal, says he will sacrifice 100 daily, and the beast finds this good. Seeing this, Shufu flees, and word of the emperor's actions spreads. Yufu, the man who suggested the emperor replace his body with mechanical parts, sees the treacherous and evil actions and sends his mechanical army to trap the emperor in his palace. He then sinks the palace into the ground, where the emperor may have no escape for his eternal life. Now, originally, I had the idea that I would stop after each of these and explain them as we went, but as I worked, I realized it was more effective to establish each of his origins first. You begin to see the connections as you go through each of them. There's a very clear pattern to follow. So instead, we'll be summarizing at the end and analyzing what we know about the Hanged King from these origins. This leads us into "And so the crows laughed." A king is hiding from a mob of his subjects within his castle walls. They find him and drag him through the palace, bind him in chains, and dress him in rags. He tries to speak, but his mouth is slammed shut. The mob grows in intensity, and no one in the palace is spared. Even the jester is found and killed, his broken mask lying on the floor. The wiser men of the city do not participate, instead fleeing. They take their art and their tomes and don't look back. They've seen the darker things in the castle, the whispers, the strange carvings, the emaciated and weak bodies of the guards, and they know the king has dabbled in something unspeakable. Still, the mob celebrated, throwing stones at the king and attacking him over and over as he lay prone on the ground. Crows began to gather in the trees to watch, making noises as if to mock the men below. They dragged the king out of the kingdom and down a hill, deeming him unfit for a formal execution, and string him up from a tree instead of a gallows. He was fashioned with a rope around his neck and hoisted onto a larger tree branch, still in his rags and chains, for none felt safe enough to remove them. Even as he hung, the king whispered words that came from places of dark and laughed until his death. None laughed any longer. They left, disquieted, and hoped the crows would swiftly deal with his remains, but no birds would touch him. The crows just circled above him and laughed. It did not take long for them to bury him in a shallow grave nearby. No one wanted to linger longer than was necessary to bury him deeper. They returned to the kingdom and tried to forget. On the first day, nothing much happened. Strange noises were reported coming from the hill where the king's body lay, and the crows had gathered, staring at the gravesite, but these were deemed the words of a madman. On the second day, much of the kingdom fell ill. They coughed and bled and writhed on the floor as if covered in heavy chains. Their blood flowed into the river and stained it. Those who had taken gold from the palace found themselves dead beside it. On the third day, the survivors found themselves able to move once again. They stood, only to mutilate themselves in vicious ways, their blood staining the river even further. The only animals remaining in the city were the crows, which had grown sharply in number. They were everywhere now. They watched as the city spiraled into madness and laughed. The soil atop the king's grave moved, and the hanged king climbed out of his grave, chains around his hands and ankles and the rope still around his neck. He emerged from the grave something otherworldly. His body was lifeless, but he was not dead. He had bargained for something else with the souls he did and didn't have. He returned to his city where people screamed and bled until they could no longer. He walked towards the dungeon where a throne covered in rusted spikes was placed. It had been left behind by the mob, thought just to be a simple torture device. He stepped upon the throne and sat, impaling himself through the spikes. It is said he would have screamed if he had not been rendered breathless by the rope. He was there to suffer forever, but it had been done, and it was then his one and only rightful throne. The palace then began to shake, and the blood river began to boil. The dungeon became a hole, and the hole warped the kingdom inside of it. And the city was in another place, not quite there, but still where they all were. It was here he would build upon the bones of his old kingdom. His jester, wearing his broken mask, returned to his side and offered him a silver cup full of blood and said, "With this, our blood, it is the hanged king's." The king took the cup, but his injured hand trembled and he was too weak to hold it. It fell to the floor, and the blood spilled on his new court. The watching crows laughed and left the city as the dead stood and walked the new, twisted streets, putting on masks to cover their personal carnage. They paraded and began a carnival, laughing and laughing until the king started to cry and scream, but his throat could not make a single sound, so he merely wept in silence. And so the king would rule this city eternally, a forever celebration where the king would have no rest. None would. Even those that fled were plagued with visions of the kingdom in its new form. They wrote dramas and poems, composed songs and paintings, and so the kingdom lived through them, even away from its whole. The King in Chains is particularly interesting as we get to see the king as he is now and as he was then. In the present, so to speak, the king sits on his throne. Every time a piece of his history is written or brought to light, another chain is added to his body, furthering his torture. In this piece of history, a kind and goodly king exists with great fortune and many lands. One day, the king begins to ask about the texts sacred to the priests, believing himself to know better than them. There was an attempt to dissuade him from seeking this knowledge, but he refused to stop. He began to speak heresies and words of great pride but little wisdom. He was pronounced a blasphemer, and his life was declared forfeit. In the present, the hanged king plucks a chain. In the past, the high prophet who pronounced the king a blasphemer is slain along with his family for 6 generations. To replace him, the king invited other magical practitioners to work foul magics upon his kingdom. The temples, roads, and citadels were abandoned to the beasts. The hanged king finds moving the chains to be pure agony, but he could feel something on the other end, something he could change. So he plucks once again. The king became powerful from his blasphemies and conquered many lands thanks to his terrible knowledge. He razed cities and destroyed temples and fields. He gave this land to the beasts. The graves grew fat, then slowly starved, as none were left to bury the dead. The hanged king could see this, could feel this. The chain pulled. One of the high prophet's descendants, removed by 7 generations, went to the palace. There he and a few companions waited for the king in his bedchambers with dagger and rope. When the king retired, the descendant Asbael struck and garroted the king, slitting his throat. His belly was opened with the knife, called long chained. From his stomach poured a great multitude of spiders and unclean things. The pulling of the chain began to draw something down to the hanged king's realm. Asbael removed the king's jaw and broke it to pieces so he could no longer declare blasphemies, then hung him from the highest peak of the palace for all to see. All knew then what seeking knowledge one should not possess could bring. His name was scattered, forgotten, all inscriptions erased, and was once more unknown, as all things should be. And his memory was hated and feared, as are all things which cannot be trusted or understood. The hanged king felt the chains split. One portion continued infinitely, pulling down at the hated words. The other remained strong and uncorrupted. The hanged king could not travel up this chain. He felt great anger towards this uncorrupted chain, which pulled at him with great strength. He knew whatever lay on the other end must be destroyed. But he also knew great joy, for no longer did he possess no agency. He could move the chains that bound him. He would grow and pull, and all the stories and words written of him would be taken and consumed by him. In the past once more, the gashes in the king's neck and stomach spoke. The neck cursed Asbael and all his bloodline. By dawn it grew silent. And from his stomach came a great and terrible voice declaring that I am the one in the shadows. All that will not be laid out and known, that is my domain. All that was once known will in time be unknown again. And you may attempt to banish me, but behold, chains bind a beast, but the binder also. You are all of you apes, and I will have what is my due. And none shall ever know the name of this king. The hanged king felt blindly around in the darkness that surrounded him and made him. In it, he found new words, ones that did not bind, but contained knowledge. He smiled, a million fractal smiles, and pulled the words in. Theology of a Snake is the last supplemental article before we get into the final 2, those being actual SCP articles with proper numerical designations. It tells of a man on a walk who met another who told him of his one true God. The first man responded that all gods were true if they were believed in, and that they were no different from demons or fairies, as they were all creatures created by the minds of men, merely under different titles. The man he met accused him of blasphemy and said his god would damn him. The first man replied, "It is not gods who damn us. It is us who make and damn the gods." He then offers us a cautionary tale to shed some light on his point of view. He tells us of a merciful king whose land was not the largest, but it had fertile soil and abundant harvests. Rivers flowed reliably across it, never too much to flood or too little to cause drought. An idyllic place where people lived peacefully and harmoniously, and all were taken care of in all manners. Many merchants gathered at the palace and exchanged artifacts and tales, and at this palace 4 lords served at the king's court, each knowledgeable in their own field. The kingdom knew little war from its isolation, but kept an army of honorable warriors that patrolled for the safety of royalty and peasant alike. The only odd thing of the kingdom was it worshipped no god. They respected their king and adored their queen, but nothing more. Even the cultural exchanges from the merchants did not move this. However, it wasn't to last. One night, the queen gave birth to a prince at the cost of her own life. The king could not find joy in his heir. His love for the queen was so great he could only grieve, and he left the prince to the servants and the lords. He withdrew from his kingdom and his people. His own malaise infected everything, and soon the people avoided the palace and whispered unkind words about those within. On the prince's first birthday, a stranger walked into the party. They were an individual of strange beauty, adorned in a black silk robe, standing tall and proud. They accused the king of neglecting his people. The four lords argued with the stranger, but each were easily defeated in turn. The king then asked what the stranger would suggest as a solution. They approached the king and whispered there were ways to bring back the queen. They explained both gods and demons had powers of resurrection, but were far from trustworthy. Instead, they suggested, the king could become a god himself. The king's eyes brightened, and he announced that the stranger was truly wise and outstanding and had proven themselves better than even his four lords. He named them the ambassador to serve as a bridge between the court and the people. The ambassador did exactly this, walking amongst the people and spreading good words of the king. The ambassador started small, merely seeking to repair the reputation of the king, but slowly beginning to build upon his tales, creating legends and epics, painting the king as a great hero. Everything the ambassador spoke became true. The king's gaunt shape became healthy and muscular, his garments made of the pelts of great beasts. His people cheered him endlessly. His sorrows washed away, replaced with joy and ambition. The palace constantly grew, eventually reaching the clouds, shining with gold and ivory. Even the land itself became more magical, with healing springs and fantastical animals. Eventually, the ambassador no longer walked the streets. Instead, people came to them willingly, gathering first in squares, then great halls, then temples, then churches. The tales turned to myths. First, the king was chosen by a god, then he was a demigod, and finally, he was meant for godhood himself. The prince was said to have God's blood in him through his father, and even the four lords were known to hold great power and be lesser gods themselves. Monuments were erected, prayers were sung, festivals where people wore masks and cheered were held, and the king and his prince and the lords too celebrated. The ambassador stood by the king's side, arrogant and beautiful as ever, and at the bottom of the castles, the queen's body lay cold in a forgotten tomb, sinking deeper into the soil. The king announced his favorite colors, and the kingdom was adorned in them and nothing else. The ambassador said the king's eyes reached every bit of the land, and with that, the entire kingdom folded into one massive city. The sun was no more, only eternal night, for the king preferred it that way, and the city floated in a heavenly space, for a kingdom of a god should not stand on mortal soil. All else but an endless party was discarded, and all must wear masks all of the time, for the king hated to see faces less gorgeous than the ambassador. He was still no god, though, for there was one line the king had never dared to cross. After much discussion with his ambassador, the ambassador ordered for sacrifices to be made, and the people rejoiced, for the king willed it. Only laughter was heard in the city. When the ambassador returned, all had shed their blood, and the rivers of the city flowed with it. The four lords donated their share upon his return. The ambassador came to the king on his throne and presented him a dagger, and the king understood one more sacrifice was to be made. He ended the life of his prince, for a god needed no heir. The king felt the great power of it all, and in that moment became a god. The four lords and the people in his grand city applauded his ascension, and a great party was thrown. The king laughed as he watched, and the ambassador stood by his side, and the queen's cold body sank deeper. After all, what was a mortal life to a living god? The ambassador whispered in the king's ear and led him higher and higher into the palace, to a place the king didn't even know existed. He was greeted with a rope. The king turned to the ambassador in confusion, but they only smiled and replied this was the final step. After all, what god would dwell in a mortal body of weakness? A final sacrifice, so that a god can be made. The king was shocked and refused, but the ambassador grabbed him and dragged him towards his death. Despite his divinity, he found himself useless against the power of the ambassador and found himself helpless and weak. He cried out to his people, but they only laughed and cheered as though this was all a stage. None would help him, for his end was foretold in every tale the ambassador had spread. Only the king had not heard of this. And so he was strangled against the rope, and his breath ran thin, and he finally became what the ambassador had made him to be. A god, but powerless in his own realm against a simple lasso. He hung for 3 days, and his blood flowed and seeped into the city. For 3 days he refused to die, and all the sounds he made were drowned out by the laughter of the ambassador and the applause of his people. For 3 days he grew colder and colder until his body was as dead as the queen, until he was but an empty husk, a hole of his previous self. On the 4th day the rope broke, and his body hit the ground. The new god arose, rope still around his neck, and stumbled after the ambassador to his court. He was sat on a throne of spikes so that his empty body would not slip and fall, and he would remain there forever. The city rejoiced once more, a never-ending celebration, and the 4 lords all knelt, and the ambassador stood as beautiful and proud as ever next to the hanged king. Finally, we get to look at our final 2, our first SCP articles proper. These are standard for the Foundation and follow a particular format, designating item number, object class, special containment procedures, and a description. For both of these, the object class is easy to explain. The first, SCP-2732, is object class safe, which means it poses no threat of a containment breach. A containment breach being something where an anomalous object breaks the containment that the Foundation has put it in. SCP-7246, the second, is object class neutralized, which means it no longer possesses anomalous properties or has been destroyed, in this case the latter. SCP-2732 is a wooden Beijing opera stage that lacks a backstage area or stairs. SCP-2732-1 is a Ming Dynasty area booklet containing 7 entries, all different accounts of the same event. These events are where we build our origin of the Hanged King. The entry itself is a fascinating read, but we're going to be focusing on its texts for the most part, rather than what the Foundation knows of its anomalous properties or how it contains it. In the booklet, we're drip-fed a story, and it's short enough I'll quote it directly. Entry 1 says, "The king of Aegea was hanged dead." Entry 2. "Back then, in the kingdom of Aegea, the king of the land was hanged but didn't die. The people there all wore masks." Entry 3. "In the kingdom of Aegea, the king was hanged but didn't die. The Serpent people feared him and burnt his city. They put a mask on him before burying him." Entry 4. "In the kingdom of Aegea, there was a king who hanged himself in the middle of the court. The whole country celebrated this and exposed his body in the wild. The next day, the king's emissary came. It had no face but laughed menacingly. The people were greatly shocked and regarded it as the likes of gods and monsters. They then offered blood sacrifice to the being." Entry 5. "That day, the kingdom of Aegea trapped their king in his court. The king asked his servant for a plan. The servant said, 'We must fight to the death.' Hence white silk was prepared. The king said, 'I will take their souls.' He hanged himself in the court, and the servant died as well. The whole country celebrated. The next day, the king's emissary came. It had no face, and after engaging, the people deemed that it was not human. They questioned the being. It laughed menacingly and answered, 'You should offer blood sacrifice.' The ministers then understood and said, 'We will sacrifice to the king.' Its people all said, 'All blood to the king.' Entry 6. That day the kingdom of Aegea trapped their king in the wild. The king asked his servant for a plan. The servant said, 'We should summon the gods.' A moment later, the dragon came. The dragon is the mother god. She said, 'One must die first so that he can return.' The 6 beasts that served under the dragon said, "You should sacrifice with all blood." The king hence used the servant as a sacrifice. The dragon said, "Good." The king then hanged himself with white silk. The whole country celebrated. The next day, the god's emissary came. It was one of the 6 beasts. The emissary was round, had no face, and bore 6 wings on its back. They questioned the being. It laughed menacingly and answered, "You should offer blood sacrifice." The ministers then understood and said, "We will sacrifice to the king, the beasts, and the dragon." Its people all said, "All blood to the king." And finally, entry 7. That day, the kingdom of Aegea trapped their king. The king hanged himself and died. The whole country celebrated this and exposed his body in the wild. 3 days later, the king's emissary, and the rest of the entry is illegible. In this entry, it's worth noting the anomalous properties. Something that the Foundation has deemed SCP 2732-2-D appears on stage and remains mostly still, but will turn its head to always face the human subject who initiated the performance. Upon examination of the anomaly, it's found that under the black silk it is wrapped in, it is composed of a mixture of cow and pig meat. Embedded within its face are a pair of human eyeballs. All 5 pairs of eyeballs of this instance have been collected and have identical DNA, indicating a male of Han ethnicity, which is another tie to Chinese folklore. SCP-7246, on the other hand, was a nitrate-based film dating back circa 1920, titled, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong despite growing up in a German household, Das Erhangen des Kaisers und der Tod seines Prinzen, or The Hanging of the Emperor and the Death of his Prince. The entry itself is quite long and a stunning read. I would highly suggest you go read it in its entirety. Honestly, even if you know nothing about SCP, it's a great work of fiction. I'm going to be giving a massively truncated summary here, taking out the parts necessary for our little origin story tour only. Quoting directly here, its main plot concerns the death of the Emperor of Alagadda and his crown prince, as well as the subsequent ascension of the Chancellor of Alagadda to the regency of the empire. The important takeaways from it are as follows. The Emperor, wanting to better serve his people, disguises himself as a beggar at the suggestion of his prince, and against the wishes of his 4 dukes, to walk amongst his subjects. He is recognized when resting against a wall and taken by some of his more displeased subjects and hanged. The prince, shortly after, is lured into the sewers and shot to death. The Chancellor rises to the role of regent, but isn't taken seriously by the lords, especially the Duke of Black. On the day of the Emperor and Prince's funeral, the Chancellor first shows up with a mask on and his face bleeding behind it. Odd. More bizarre, the proceedings are interrupted by the Duke of Black. He bursts in with a small army and accuses the Chancellor of treason. The Duke of Yellow accuses the Duke of Black of the same thing for bringing an army into the funeral. The Duke of Black claims the old emperor was a weak-willed sovereign and that it was only fitting he died when he did before Adytum invaded again. The Duke of Yellow cries it is still treason and tells him to reserve his fire for when the time is truly at hand. The Chancellor realizes that the Duke of Black has been planning this from the start, and that he is the reason that both the Emperor and the Prince are dead. The Duke of Yellow announces that the Chancellor is right. The Duke of Black looks confused for a moment, but claims it doesn't matter now, and fires at the Duke of Yellow, killing him. He then turns his gun on the Chancellor. The Chancellor begs him not to, tells him it isn't the way, but the Duke of Black does not listen. He says this is his right as the killer of the Emperor to become the ruler of his empire. He shoots twice, and the Chancellor falls to the ground. The Duke of Black steps to the dais and calls out, "I invoke the tradition of Alagadda. I proclaim the words that the Sword King said to the Emperor of the Davites on the day Adytum was razed to the ground. By the right of blood, I conquer. By the right of murder, I take. By the right of defacement, I destroy." The Chancellor, cradling his wounded stomach, begs him no. The Duke of Black begins to make his way to the Emperor's coffin. He throws the coffin's lid aside. The Chancellor begs his dead regent to defend himself, defend his body. The Duke of Black is thrown to the ground after seizing the corpse inside. He gets to his feet, charging the coffin as the Chancellor tries to crawl his way to it. The Emperor's body is pulled above the coffin. A noose and a rope manifest around his neck, stretching out of view. He hangs limply from the ceiling. The Duke of Black freezes. The body is slowly pulled across the stage and toward his throne, lowered onto it by the rope. Slowly he opens his eyes. They're glassy. The Duke of Black screams, scrambling backward. The Emperor, he is alive! He is alive once again! The Emperor's tongue lolls out, covered in a black substance. He says, "Your Emperor is not dead yet, my Duke of Black." His mouth moves, but unnatural, in a manner incompatible with speech. He accuses the Duke of treason and exiles him from his kingdom, stating, "No more shall you step foot in my throne room, no more shall you walk as yourself. You shall be reduced to a shadow of life, a manner not dissimilar to a corpse." The Chancellor shoots the Duke with his own gun. The Emperor turns his head to him and decrees that this is not a fate he would reserve for the Chancellor. Ropes descend, wrapping around his body, and haul him to his feet. He holds on to the ropes on his wrists, and his wounds begin to close. His flesh begins to knot around the mask tied to his face. He thanks the Emperor. The Emperor then addresses his subjects, telling them that they shall celebrate each day until the end of time, for he has returned to them. Now don the masks of mirth and celebrate my return. At once they comply, the Duke of Yellow returning to life and joining the Duke of White and the Duke of Red in the merriment. As they celebrate, the Emperor thanks the Chancellor for his service and tells him he is glad of it, for he now must rest. As he speaks, ropes begin to cover his whole body. He declares the Chancellor his ambassador and states, "You will make my will known to the Empire. You will be my voice when my voice is absent. Now go and make merry with my subjects." He goes limp, held up only by the noose tying him from the ceiling. The prince's coffin lays closed and forgotten. The people celebrate. We just took a look at 6 different articles available on the wiki, 4 of them supplemental material and 2 of them proper SCP entries. Each of them is a little bit different, but from them we can draw similarities and consistencies that will help us better understand the Hanged King and who he is. We have the 3 essential elements I mentioned before: a king or some sort of ruler who is hanged and returns. Notably, we can't exactly say returns to life, as a hallmark of many of these tales is the Hanged King being somewhere between living and dead in a perpetual state of torture. Another common element is the idea of punishment, warranted or otherwise. The king has done something in these tales to warrant some sort of retribution. Usually this is seeking out some sort of forbidden knowledge, whether that be the secret to eternal life or some sort of religious texts. The king possesses a hubris that proves to be his downfall. His geographic origins in our own world are next to impossible to pin down. We have stories of typical European depictions, stories of explicitly Chinese origin, and even one that comes from Germany. The Hanged King has no specific ethnic tie. He is something all-consuming, all-present. He has existed everywhere and nowhere, and that's largely the point. The citizens and all of Alagadda itself has become a facade. Like set dressing on a stage, they all exist to play a part. The citizens exist to endlessly celebrate and indulge themselves to the point of ruin. They have nothing deeper to them. They're merely characters, archetypes. They exist to torture the Hanged King for his daring to attempt to seize knowledge that should have never been his in the first place. The Hanged King represents the absence of godliness in the shape of a god, the end point of the curiosity that killed the cat. Knowledge both binds and feeds him. He seeks to be unknowable so that he may garner power, and seeks that which is known to grow that power. All things of knowledge disappear into Alagadda, where he reigns. He is a mortal who ascended to godhood and is punished at every moment for that. In many instances, he isn't even the one in control. The ambassador, representing an extremely powerful reality bender, is present throughout his origins. He is the stranger with the forbidden knowledge, the cup bearer of the blood. He is the one truly pulling the strings to the Hanged King's ascension, tantamount to his creator. The Lords of Alagadda aren't present in every story, but when they are, we see them as they are reflected in Alagadda. 4 lords of each of Alagadda's cardinal colors that serve the king. Their power is always second fiddle to the ambassadors. If the ambassador serves a higher power, we aren't certain, but it does seem that he uses the Hanged King as his own figurehead. If you're interested in more on the Hanged King, I'd love to make more videos on the topic. There's a lot I had to cut from this for brevity's sake. I could go into the original SCP article, more on the Ambassador and the Lords of Alagadda itself, or even the lasting effect the creation of Alagadda has had on our baseline reality. I would love to hear your thoughts about the Hanged King. Was there anything that you caught that I missed? Do you have any thoughts yourself? I would love to discuss with you in the comments about this. If you liked this video, please stick around. I'll be doing book reviews, movie discussion, deep dives, and more about all the things that make you look over your shoulder at night. Thank you all for creeping it real, and I'll see you next time. Bye!